Hi, I'm Terry Patar. Welcome to this episode of the Janes podcast. I'm joined on this episode by Tim Marshall. Tim was former diplomatic editor and foreign correspondent for Sky News, has been a journalist for over 30 years, and more recently has been the author of the best-selling Prisoners of Geography, which is a fantastic book that we're going to come on to talk about. And more recently, one of the follow-up books to it, The Power of Geography, which we'll also talk to Tim about. So, Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for the invitation.
It's great to have you on and I was really keen to talk to you because the books that you've written are the books that I probably recommend most often to people, especially people in our sector or our industry, where I work with a lot of young analysts who come into their roles. Often they're asked to monitor and analyze what's going on in particular countries, particular parts of the world where they may have no prior knowledge of those areas. And I think the books that you've written are fantastic primers on understanding how those countries have developed in the way they have. And so hence why I recommend them so often. But before we come on to talk about the books, I thought maybe it'd be useful to talk about your prior career in journalism and to find out a little bit more about sort of what led you to the point where you wanted to write the books. And so what actually initially led you into journalism, in particular being a foreign correspondent?
A bit of luck, really. Before I go into that, thanks for that lovely introduction, because I'm very aware that I'm in the presence of proper experts at Janes. No, seriously, okay, it's a mutual loving society at the moment, but I am a generalist. I am essentially a hack with a journalist's view, and we're often not proper experts. So it's really heartening to hear that the books have resonated in parts of your world as well, which is great. And I think I don't take the word primer as an insult, perhaps almost as a compliment, because I'm not
definitely meant as a compliment. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not pretending to be, a proper expert. Sorry, to answer your question.
But I think just on that, I think there's a real art and a real skill to making understandable for a non-expert audience something that is a deeply complex topic. And I think in each of the case studies that you present in your books, I think you've done that really well.
I think that takes, a journalist's eye, because academics are A, often cleverer, and B, far more knowledgeable about their subject, but through no fault of their own, through the pressures of work, they're often in silos. And when you're in the silo, it's often hard to see into the other silo, and certainly how it connects with various silos. Whereas a journalist can do that sort of bird's eye view. I got into journalism because I always wanted to, although you don't always get what you want. To mangle a song line, because I wanted to be a journalist from when I was a kid, from when I was maybe 12, but it didn't really seem possible, or certainly didn't seem probable, because I left school at 16 with no qualifications, and I worked on building sites, painter and decorator, very, very poor one, not financially, well, both financially actually and in the skill set. But I always had this curiosity about the world, which was forged young. Despite not being academic at school, I was struck by things such as a tender age of Martin Luther King's funeral on television, and just thinking, well, what's all that about, and wanting to know more about it. Seeing the first footage of Auschwitz when I was about 12, things like that just really struck a chord with me and made me curious about the world. And then through a very convoluted route, I managed to get 3 days work at LBC Radio, which turned into 30 years work, overall. I just managed, through a bit of luck, a bit of knowing somebody that I met who worked at LBC IRN, who got me through that door. Yeah, and I was lucky. There's a bit of hard work there as well, but I was lucky.
That's really interesting. But then what sort of sustained you through that career, and what made you in particular want to develop some of the directions that you went in? Because you went and covered conflicts in different places, and you travel all around the world really within that job. And so
you got paid for it. The fools. No, I immediately had very little interest in anything other than either football or foreign affairs. But of course, you can't start a career as a foreign correspondent. You have to build up to it. And I actually started in sports. Well, I started as being the dog's body T-boy, and then went into sports journalism on the sports desk, and then managed to get across into a bit of news. And then I went to Paris. I just packed everything into a car and moved to Paris, because LBC IRN didn't have a Paris correspondent. And one of the jokes at the time was that people kept on going over there and saying, I'll be your freelance over there, and disappearing down the metro, and they were never heard of again. Well, I was, oh, and I should repeat my Chancellor story. They did say to me, you do speak French, don't you? And I said, well, you don't think I'd be so stupid as to go to Paris without speaking French, which of course wasn't a lie, it was a question. Anyway,
Brilliant.
I went there and I was absolutely determined not to disappear down the metro. And so I think I did leapfrog a little bit because I had 3 years there, despite not really having any solid news journalism experience. But, I made a fist of it. And then when I came back, I joined Sky as a junior reporter only on the home beat. But Sky was under-resourced, 24-hour news, big canvas on which to paint. So every now and again, you would be thrown, oh, just turn those pictures around, on a foreign story. And I think they very quickly realized that that's where my passion, where I was putting most things into. And so it took about 3 years before I got my first foreign, I think. But then once I had that, I was up and running and got more and more foreign jobs, and it all just came together.
That's fantastic. And then what led you on to sort of deciding to write the books? And
Yeah,
because
sorry,
as I
you
said,
did.
those have been great. And there's a certain element there of, I guess, trying to understand what's going on in the world, which was part of your career anyway. But what made the decision for you to write
Sorry,
those
yeah,
books?
you alluded to what led in that direction. A number of things. One, I realized relatively early on, probably early 90s, the importance of geography in explaining the complexity of the stories I was covering. I hasten to add, not as the determining factor, and I'm not a determinist, but as a determining factor that was often missing. And I injected it into most of the work I did. And I enjoyed some of the writing that I did that newspapers would ask me to do and things like that. And well, a number of things happened. One, I wouldn't say burnout, but I was pretty exhausted. After 9/11, I pretty much sprinted for 12, 15 years. Just, non-stop travel, pretty intense places often, very long hours. I don't think I was burnt out, but I do think I was tired. I had a bit of ill health as well. And then so I just thought, timing is so important. And I didn't want to be one of those old bores, chuntering around the newsroom saying, oh, it's not like it was in my day, which of course is a blinding state of the obvious, because of course it wasn't. That was then and this is now. Be quiet. So I didn't want to be that guy. And I always made sure I said to the young journalists, now is your time. Now is the golden age. Don't believe, I had a golden age. People before me said, oh, we had the golden age. Well, you're going to have a golden age as well, because it's a great job. So it was just time, it was time to do something else. And I hit lucky again. I'd written a terrific book about football chants called Dirty Northern Bar Stewards, which sold a few thousand. And it wasn't really about football chants. It was about Britain and its tribalism and its instincts, and why we might like making fun of each other without being too unpleasant sometimes. And then I just had this idea of that we were prisoners of geography.
Was there a particular place where it occurred to you, actually, in this country,
No,
you can very
I should
visibly
say
see the effects of
a number of things. Robert Kagan's book, Paradise and Power, this idea that in Europe we've created paradise. I mean, he's not foolish enough to think that it's, all honey and sugar and manna from heaven, but comparative to most parts of the world, we live in paradise.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world is the world of power. And you shouldn't mix up what you can do with the rule of law and everything in the world of paradise with what you can do out there in the world of power. It was had quite an influence on me. And there was The Revenge of Geography by Robert Kaplan. Again, that sort of ballpark view of the world, and other things. And I just thought I could do this. I suppose the only real light bulb moment was just looking at Russia. And then, just look at that map and keep looking at it and keep looking at it, and then inject all the things you know about Russia, and how cold it is and how warm it is and how big it is and its history. And I just thought, there it is right there. That is the best example in the world of how geography determines, to a great extent, but not entirely, what happens. And it all just flowed from that, really. Then the challenge was, well, which areas do you pick? and I left out Australia and was roundly abused nicely by Australians for it. No, so I came up with this formula, a case study, which is a chapter. Start with the geography. Once you've explained that, explain the connections between that and then what happened, the history, and then layer on top of that the current affairs. And when you've got that foundation, the current affairs become easier to put into context. And it is a formula that clearly worked, and I've repeated it in the new book, but also in other books as well.
Yeah, I think it works really well. And well, obviously, in the first book, you picked out some of the probably the most obvious cases to look at, so Russia, China, etc. But was there any sort of specific criteria that led you to pick certain ones, or was it just that these are the ones that are really driving what's going on globally?
Yeah, the latter.
Yeah.
It was the big players, and then I was conscious that although let's say is not a big player, or indeed Namibia, that it would be unfair to leave out large sections of the world, and so I did have to condense the entire continent of Africa into one chapter. Ditto Latin America, so I wanted to get these big geographic areas in Russia, China, India, Pakistan, USA with a nod at Canada, continent of Latin America, continent of Africa, and just get those big players in. Whereas the new book, Power of Geography, it goes down a level to the second tier country.
And for when you were writing it, I mean, what audience did you have in mind? Was it a broader audience, I guess, because it's gone on to become a bestseller? But what was there anyone in particular you would think you were trying to aim it at?
I'm not capable of writing for academia. I don't have the depth of knowledge, the style, or indeed the language, because people that do MAs and PhDs, they actually do have to use certain types of language. They cannot use casual phrases, and I'm simply not capable of doing that. So it wasn't a sort of active choice that I will write a generalist book. I didn't have a choice. It was the only book I could write, and I do believe get it out there and see who wants it. And I've been gratified that there have been eminent historians, top universities that have said nice things about it. Peter Frankopan's been very complimentary, for example. I know John Bew, who's now in Downing Street, has perhaps skimmed a few pages, and others. And then I get letters from, emails from 15-year-old geography students. So there's quite a spectrum. So yeah, my generalist approach was writing in general for a general audience of wherever they come from.
Yeah, that's great, and it works really well because I think so many people take away things from it that they probably don't expect, when they start reading it. Was there anything in there, in any of these books that you sort of, as you were researching and writing about, that actually surprised you? And especially given you've travelled to probably a lot of these places as well, and you've seen a lot of them.
Yeah, on my desk I keep one of those mats to protect the desk, which is a map of the world, and I always at the points like this look down at it for inspiration. Yes, I think I mean obviously you learn a lot when you're doing the research. So, I mean, a number of things spring to mind. One, until I did the research, I wasn't aware of the concept of Latin America as the hollow continent, and just how many people cling to this day to the rim of it and not to the interior. Again, that's in broad brush. Let's have another thing. Oh yeah, when I wrote the book about walls, a book called Divided. The spark for that was reading this stat that 65 countries now had walls or barriers between them and their neighbors, which is a third of all the countries in the world. And I suddenly thought, hang on, that how does that fit into globalization? And so that there's a book right there. What is happening and why is it happening? I learned something the other day. I haven't actually checked if you're in the West Midlands, let's say in West Bromwich, looking eastwards, what's the nearest mountain range? And apparently it's the Urals in a straight line.
Wow.
I haven't checked this,
okay,
because apparently if you go in a straight line across, you do go across the North European plain, which is flat. Right. And so if you go through that gap where the Carpathians end in Poland and you're going in that straight line, then the next proper mountain range is actually the Urals. So just little things like that always spark my attention. I'll try and give you one more example. Again, just the starkness of the lack of water in Australia. I mean, it's something I think we all know. It's one of those things you just know. There's not a great deal of water in Australia. But when I went and actually looked into it properly about where the river systems are, which of course is exactly where the people are, 85% of them live in that arc on the right-hand side of Australia as we look at it on the map. So yeah, in each country I was learning little things. The Flags book, which isn't about flags really, it's about nationalism and identity, called Worth Dying For. Just, well, every single flag had a fantastic story to tell that, most of them I didn't know. Like the Ethiopian flag goes back to the alleged union in a biblical sense of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And allegedly their son was the emperor of Ethiopia, hence why during Haile Selassie's reign there was the Lion of Judah in the middle of the Ethiopian flag. I mean, I just love stuff like that. I'm a nerd.
Well, I think we all are. I mean, it's what we have in common, I guess. And there was so many little snippets in the books that as I was reading through them, that surprised me, and some that still stand out in my mind. And one that just came to mind was when you were talking about the distance on maps. It was, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I seem to remember you'd written that Beijing is actually geographically nearer to Warsaw than it is to Australia.
Yeah, it's useful. If you bother to stop and think, well, what does that actually mean? Because it isn't just that, in a straight line, it's closer to Warsaw. It's that when you then think it through, you get a much better idea that China's got a 360-degree view of the world. Whereas, let's be honest, in Australia, you of course, everybody has a 360-degree view, but if you're focusing, Australia only focuses pretty much to its north. Whereas somewhere like China has to have a 360-degree focus a lot of the time. I mean, the UK, again, our focus is pretty much south, east, and east because of where we are on the map, because to the west, there's a lot of water.
Yeah.
So little facts like that, they're sort of, oh, that's interesting. And then when you go into what it means, it becomes even more interesting.
Yeah, and you mentioned your book about walls and barriers coming up between countries. This is something I've certainly noticed over the years. Since I sort of started my career, and I remember being a student in the late '90s, and maybe that was I don't know. We've talked about golden eras already, but that felt like a bit of a golden age because you could, I spent a fair bit of time in the Middle East, and it felt really easy to travel around, and it was sort of in that window probably between the Oslo Accords and 9/11 happening. And pretty much the only places you wouldn't go is if you were a Brit. Well, you weren't allowed into Libya. Algeria, I think, was still going through a phase of political violence in the mid to late '90s. But the rest of the region, it was really easy to travel around. You can buy a bus ticket in Egypt that would take you all the way to Istanbul
without worrying that someone's made a phone call, having seen you, and 2 hours up the road, someone's going to have a quiet word with you. Yeah,
exactly,
it was.
And it feels like certainly since then. And do you think 9/11 was the sort of big catalyst for that in terms of a lot of what's happened since
definitely.
then, and walls coming up between countries?
It opened up the Pandora's box. I mean, it was ajar already because, I sometimes think when it comes to 9/11, people think it was year zero. You can make a fist of that argument, but let's face it, I think things like the USS Cole had already been attacked, and there'd already been various mass slaughters in Egypt prior to that by Islamist ideologues. But yeah, let's face it, 2001 is when it really took off. And of course, the invasion of Iraq, which further inflamed passions all over the place. And it doesn't really show too many signs of settling down yet. But I think it's not as bad as it was 4 or 5 years ago. But it's still a volatile part of the world, sadly. And all the things that there's no real starting point in history. I mean, you can make arguments that, well, I would, that the end of the Cold War, of course, is a marker in history, and then flowing from it, there are so many things, and I think you can even place 9/11 within that. The end of the Cold War opened up all these different scenarios and areas and conflicts that had been frozen were then allowed to simmer, and then some of them boil over, and then you throw in 9/11, all that, and we are still living through the post Cold War era, and how unsettled it has made us. I'm arguing very loosely in the book, cogently elsewhere, that I think we are heading back to a new bipolar world. I only use the phrase because it's useful to frame an idea. I'm not arguing it will be the same as the previous bipolar, nor will it be the same as the Cold War. But I think I think there is a form of Cold War. And I think we're heading towards a bipolar world. You don't know if you've seen the latest copy of Foreign Affairs magazine, the quarterly.
I haven't actually, no.
It's very gratifying when something you've been banging on for about a year suddenly appears as the lead story in Foreign Affairs. But there's two eminent American scholars basically saying it's a Cold War now.
Interesting. I do sometimes, though, feel that it's unhelpful when, for example, you hear voices in the US government frame China as a threat, when really it's a competitor. It's a competition, it's a rivalry. It's going to be going for a long time.
Yeah.
Calling them a threat, I don't think
I
does
agree
everyone,
with you.
it does anyone any favors.
No, I mean, it's one thing for someone like me to call it a Cold War, which, again, I do think you can make a fist of it, but it's not helpful at that level when it is taken in Beijing as a threat. Because, I mean, the language did change, didn't it? It went from strategic competitor to strategic threat in some circles. And that is a very, very different thing. And I'm not sure just how much of a global threat China is. I think it's a regional threat, and I think it is a threat to the international sea lanes in its part of the world. And I think if they are broken, that does endanger freedom of navigation everywhere. But, they're not ideologues. They're not communists. They don't want everyone to think the way they do. They don't want to go and take vast swathes of territory. They want to take a little bit of territory that they think is theirs anyway. So, I mean, this is what I mean. It's not the same as the previous Cold War, but in conceptual terms, to try and tell us where we're going, as long as you then go into the detail. I mean, perhaps we disagree, but I think they're useful broad brush terms.
No, I think, true. I think there is that, and I think it's just indicative of also people's perspectives and how they see the issue, and the language that they use to describe it. And we are going to hopefully live through this. It's a coming era, which, as you said, it's interesting. You say it's bipolar world, because I think a lot of people are talking about it being multipolar.
Yes. No, I think it's multipolar at the moment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, I completely agree with that. It went bipolar, unipolar. We're deep into multipolar now, but I just think that will. Because you could argue that the previous bipolar world was a multipolar world at the same time, in that there were all these actors on each side, but they coalesced around one side or the other. And I think that is exactly what will happen again. And I think you're seeing that already with what this Biden's idea of not the West, but the advanced democracies binding together in various forms, but they are all binding together under the umbrella of the Americans. And the very few friends that China has, or those that it is bullied into being its friends, ditto. So in what I believe will be a bipolar world, yes, of course, there's still that space underneath it for multiple actors, but at a global level, I think it is still split into two.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you talked about globalization a little bit. You touched on that a bit earlier, and especially with walls coming up between countries, and maybe whether, I'm sure people would debate whether we're in a retreat from globalization or whether it was a myth in the first place. But in your career, sort of traveling around the world, I mean, did you find it was getting harder and harder to get access to certain places? And what did that mean for you as a journalist? Perhaps was that ever an issue? And because I know for a lot of journalists, it seems to be getting harder to find out what's going on in different parts of the world.
It wasn't really. Well, we always had trouble getting into Iran. I mean, right. I went 3 or 4 times, and it was, it was 6-7 months work by a dedicated producer. Well, name check him, Kelvin O'Shea, who used to just he knew how things worked. He would go for tea at midnight. He would, spend endless hours. Yeah, that's often what it takes to get into places like that, to get your journalist visas. North Korea, I failed. Never did that. But no, I don't think it was, apart from those 2, it wasn't particularly difficult to get into places and to move around. And I don't think I saw a particular hardening of attitudes until really, I think the Arab uprisings, that hardened a lot of people's attitudes. But there's a timeline here, James, I think, which starts in Bosnia. It's slightly a different subject, forgive me, but there is a connection. In Bosnia, that was the first war where overtly journalists were targets and were seen as taking sides. And I think there's a connection there with the advent of satellite television, because we were aware in Bosnia that all three sides were watching the reports that we put out. And then later on in the Kosovo War, I remember every night when I was reporting from Belgrade or Kosovo, whatever report I did was then retransmitted on Serbian television with voiceovers, not always accurately. And you began to become seen as a player as opposed to a reporter. And then that, I think, has worsened and got more, and journalists from, let's say, Al Jazeera or TRT or BBC, wherever you're from, you're increasingly seen as they must be spies, or they are the mouthpiece of the government, or whatever, which in one or two cases is not too far from the truth. So I'm trying to connect this back.
Well, I think that is really interesting, because that is, you've almost sort of then given us the build up to the area that we're in now, where you're starting to get the politicization of news and politicians talking about fake news and dismissing certain outlets out of hand, and not willing to talk to certain outlets, etc. And you think, actually, there's probably now that's engendered probably amongst the audience, ordinary people.
Yes, I was going to
idea of actually we're not sure we trust these people.
Yeah, you're right. Bang up to date with, I don't know, Michael Gove getting harassed in the street. Basically. But so the reason I mentioned the Arab uprisings, which I don't call the Arab Spring, always hated that phrase, is that it just seemed to become so acute then. And what you had then was, in Syria, Arab journalists from a certain country, if they're from Egypt or they're from Saudi or they're from Qatar or whatever, are immediately seen by one faction as the enemy, irrelevant of what they're reporting and what they're doing. And it just got so much more acute. And of course, that was because of the power plays that were going on throughout the Middle East by the Arab governments. And it just made things worse and worse. And then you bring it all the way up to the present. And then you've got politicians like Trump egging people on and talking about fake news, which, despite being a Trumpian phrase, is used now by people that loathed him, but he has got inside their heads rent free, and he's influenced them to go down the very road that he beat the path down, which is kind of ironic. Yeah, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. I think the mainstream has to have more confidence in what it does. And I think you just have to keep getting that message across, especially to a younger audience. Teach critical thinking and teach people to try to say, well, where does this news come from? And what are the checks and balances in it and all the rest of it? And you will find 9 times out of 10 that the mainstream media, for all the derision that's heaped upon it, is where the real action and credibility is.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I mean, teaching critical thinking to younger analysts, younger generations, school kids, etc. That's one of the drums that I've been banging for a long time, because it's one of the things that we've even found in our field, where we look at mostly intelligence and working with national security and government clients around the world. But the people who are coming into those roles as analysts are finding it difficult and challenging, increasingly challenging, to sift the information they're looking at and figure out, well, what do I believe, what don't I believe, what is more reliable, what is less reliable. And I think in the past, when I started doing this, probably, we were doing that type of training 10 years ago or so, people probably thought, when you talk to them about assessing reliability of your sources, a lot of people just sort of switched off and they thought, well, that's easy, we know how to do that. That's not a problem. And then as we've gone on and we've gone through the last decade, it's actually become more and more challenging, and people are now sort of asking, okay, well, give us more advice on that. Let's talk a bit more about that. How do we actually do that? Is there a system? Is there a way in which we can just discover the reliable information that's out there? But I mean, it's just down to assessing every PCC. But actually, as you said, and we always come back to, well, sometimes it is about just going back to those mainstream news sources if you want to find out what's going on, because they may have the more factual detail. And
they have their issues, their problems. Some of them have their take on things, which I don't like. But in newspapers, it's more acceptable than it is in broadcasting. But even with those biases that they have, we know that the Guardian is left of centre, fine. We know that the Telegraph is right of centre, fine. But in both of those places, you will find a genuine attempt to get to the bottom of things and present them as they are, and a reluctance, a sacred duty, you could almost argue, not to just grab wholly lies and inject them into it to prove your point. You don't get that in the mainstream media, but you do get it in many of these other forums, and that's because they are approaching it from the worldview that my view is right and needs to be promulgated, and your view is wrong and must be completely stamped on, and therefore I am justified for the greater good to put my lies front and center. There is a worrying trend, I think, in parts of mainstream journalism, that there is a worldview, and you must approach the story from that worldview, which I don't like. And I don't like it when I see reporters without much experience saying things like, in my view, or you got to
That
be very
seems to have
careful.
crept in a lot over the last
Yeah,
few years.
and I've shouted at telly a number of times recently when I've heard a very good journalist, but they'll say things to a politician, which is clearly their opinion, the reporter's opinion. There was one recently, and I won't name it because there's no point in just stirring up unpleasantness, but they said to the Prime Minister, you have brought your party because of whatever it was. Now, you might think that, and the way to do that is to say, some people in your party or member have said that you have brought shit. That's all you need to do. Just put that barrier, because that is true. Some people had said that. But for a journalist, a broadcast journalist, to say you have brought shame, I think just doesn't cross a line. It drives a tank through it.
Yeah. And do you think that's part of a broader trend, though, where news outlets are asking their journalists to provide their take on things because they've got to differentiate themselves from their competitors?
Yes, yeah, good point. I hadn't thought of it in those terms. I was encouraged often to put more of myself into a piece, and I tried not to, but that was more to create this personality that you know and trust, not to say, I think Das Kapital was the greatest book ever written or whatever. Yeah, I think that is a danger. I think when you get to a certain level, when you really are experienced and you are one of the top people in your field, John Simpson perhaps might be an example. When you are an editor, I think it is acceptable to say, what's your take on this new policy by, and as long as the journalist then doesn't say, well, this policy is wrong and needs to be scrapped, but if they can say, well, as I assess it and I look back at the history, you can see that this happened, or to give a take is okay. To give an opinion about right, unless you're talking about I don't know, the liberation of Auschwitz, or some other extreme example, you shouldn't be going there.
Yeah. Do you find that it irritates you as well, though, when there's a sort of a stretched attempt sometimes to present balance on issues?
Yeah. That's a
And
really difficult one, though, isn't it?
yeah.
Because COVID skeptics, for example, or vaccination skeptics is, for one of the new examples, there are at least hundreds of thousands of people who are skeptical. Now, the fact that in my view, it is anti-science, but do you give 50-50 balance to that? Do you have an hour-long program with two people who each get equal time when? And if you do, do you go into the percentages? Well, in this country, 6% of people believe this, so we'll give them 6% of the time. It's a minefield. I'm not sure you can have hard and fast for it. Yeah, sorry. You've identified the problem, and I'm far from having a solution to it.
Well, yeah, no, I don't think anyone does, but it seems like it's all, it's certainly a current issue, I think, where more and more people are noticing. Coming back to your books and thinking about, geography and the role it plays, do you think actually some of the issues we've experienced recently, things like COVID, things like the supply chain issues we've seen, those have made geography a lot more real for people who maybe hadn't really paid much attention to it until then?
Yeah, supply lines especially. A bunch of stuff like, if last summer you were waiting for your garden furniture to arrive and then you found out that it's sitting on a dock in Shanghai in a container because A, meant the workforce weren't making them or taking them to the dockside, or that the shops had shut here and we weren't ordering, all that supply chain thing. And the recent example in Felixstowe, when we, for whatever reason, did not have the HGV drivers, Yeah, I think that sparks people's awareness of geography and interconnectedness. Geopolitical level, I also think it's COVID has accelerated so many trends. I don't think it's a massive world game changer if you're looking over the span of a century. Of course, it's hugely influential at the moment, and the ramifications will be felt for several years. But I don't think it's historic game changer. I think it's accelerated existing trends. One of them was already globalization was at least slowing, and we were already becoming aware of the dangers of a pretty much a single supply chain, China. And a lot of people were already looking at how to diversify, and Mexico and Vietnam and places were beginning to undercut China, and I think COVID has accelerated that. Other things, just as asides, to this day, I think it's 85% of global trade by volume travels by sea. And yet, you do find people that say, well, technology means that geography isn't important anymore. And they are completely wrong.
Yes. Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, I think it's nice that it helps more people work from home, but yeah,
Well,
no,
that was already
bigger
very
picture.
slowly happening.
Yeah, it was.
And it's accelerated it.
Yeah.
And it'll be fascinating if you can wave a magic wand and in 12 months' time, it's over.
Yeah.
I'm making these figures up, but let's say 5% of people worked from home, and now let's say it's 50% of people. I cannot believe that after my magic wand is waved, it will remain at 50%. The only question is, how close back to 5% does it go?
Yeah.
I mean, because I think there would be a significant move back. But even if you went back to 10%, and forgive me for just making up these ballpark figures, but the sort of the point I'm trying to make is that even if it went back to 10% and you had doubled the amount of home working, that's what I mean about it accelerating an existing trend.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, definitely. You touched in the power geography on issues like climate change and talking about solar energy and how that would have an impact on power relations between different countries. What do you see coming next, though? Is there something you're now thinking about, you're mulling over, that you're maybe going to write about next, or what's sort of the future in the short term to medium
there's
term?
things I'm worried about right now. Not that it makes any odds whether I'm worried or not, but and then there's one or two things that are coming up in the future which fascinate me. Climate change is pushing people to move, and it's pushing poverty, which is pushing people to move, and it pushes conflict, which pushes people to move, and it is a vicious circle, or the three things are interconnected. And given that the projections are that we won't hit our targets by 2030 or 2050, the problems are going to probably become exacerbated, and therefore the pressures exacerbated, and therefore the movement of peoples increased, with a concurrent knock-on effect on politics everywhere. Whether it's Indian nationalism because of so many Bangladeshis coming over the border, or Bangladeshi nationalism because so many people from Myanmar coming over their border, or European nationalism, people coming over. Wherever it is, I think that hasn't peaked, and I find that very, very worrying. I'm well aware of our need for migration and to sustain the population and grow it and fulfill all the jobs that are going to be doing in the inverted age pyramid that we have. But if we don't do it in a manageable, sustainable manner, I worry about the effect on our politics and everybody else's. You've seen what's happened in Germany. 85, what I would regard as extreme right wingers in the parliament. 85, in AFD. Ditto places like Sweden. In fact, right across the continent, we have so far, comparatively, not gone down that road. You can't say that we might not. So that's the current thing that bothers me. Looking ahead to the future, I'm filled with hope and wonder about technology. I think it's going to be fantastic. I think it's going to solve, just as technology has solved so many of our problems already, like in this country, clean water or inoculations against various diseases. I mean, a list as long as your arm. I just think that technology will continue to do that and continue to provide solutions to our problems, as well as bringing new challenges and hypersonic missiles or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the bit in the future that I'm trying to think about more and more. is technology and its on us, including and perhaps especially in space. I mean, as you know, there's a chapter on space in the new book, because I view it as a geographic area,
Yeah.
which has to be viewed just as you view geography on Earth. You need to conceptualize this space out there in geographic terms of distance, how long to send a message. I mean, there's all sorts of things like in future. Sorry, I'm bouncing around the ideas, but that's where I am at the moment. We've always known about comms in communications in defense, in warfare. You know, we used to have 3 days to make up our minds about things, and then it was a day, and then it was a telephone call, and now the decision's already made because of, you know, modern technology, and events have already happened, dear boy.
Yeah.
In the future, we're going to have to sort of think about things like, well, you're up near Mars, and that's, I don't know what it is, let's say it's 7 minutes away, and they're up near Mars as well. And there's been a bit of, I'm afraid our two spaceships have bumped into each other, and I've got 7 minutes to get my message back and tell you about it, and another 7 minutes before you. So I've got to wait 14 minutes. You know, just little things like that. I'm really enjoying exploring, and because I do see it very, very much in geopolitical, or rather now astropolitical terms, and I just think it's an exciting area for people that do more. You do, you know, specialists in defence to be looking at.
Oh, well, I mean, you've hit on what is pretty much one of the major growth areas, if not the major growth area, I think, in defence and security at the moment, which is looking at space and understanding how things will work and what the dynamics will be and what the technology will allow us to do, what, you know, as you described, the challenges of that
And the
as well.
treaties, which I argue we don't have.
Yeah.
You know, they don't exist. People say they exist, but if they're not ratified, which they weren't, they don't really exist.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, a lot for us to ponder and think about.
But I'm optimistic about most things, and I really got to say that, you know, no, seriously, you know, do you want to live 400 years ago or now, 200 years ago or now, 100 years ago or now?
Yeah.
Now, probably, if you ask that same question in 400 years, it'll still be now, as in 400 years time.
Yeah, and I'm sure anyone who remembers the UK in the 70s probably says now as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a much better place for all the many things that I could list that's wrong with it. Yeah.
But what's also slightly interesting is you touched on your book about football chants, and I was thinking about the takeover of Newcastle United recently that we've seen, and the influence of foreign money that's coming into the game in the UK. And again, we're sort of, it's almost like your books are sort of neatly intersecting, in that you're getting the geopolitics coming into the football and. I imagine
we have foreign money in my club, Leeds, Italian. We love our owner. He is absolutely building the way a club should be built. But our manager, the Saint Marcello, as we call him, I agree with him. We need to find a way of actually getting money, reducing the money in the game. It'll make the game better. Putting more and more money into it does not make it better.
No, that's true. Yeah, but interesting as well to see how some of these geopolitical rivalries might play out, I think, as we go forward through this season into next season.
Yeah, I watched the Newcastle Spurs game. I mean, I knew in advance that there would be several hundred Geordies dressed up as Arabs. And I knew that the Spurs fans would sing things like they did, such as Halal the Lads, many other chant jokes, the Saudi boys instead of the Geordie boys, etc., etc. Most of it good-hearted. It's problematic, isn't it? It really is problematic. Look, my club went to Myanmar on a pre-season tour about 3 years ago. They should never have done that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you. This has been a really interesting sort of journey around the work that you produced and some of the things that you've written about, and to get your thoughts on it's been really interesting, and to find out a little bit about what's driven that.
Thanks, and I hope the real experts aren't shouting too much at their podcast device.
No, I think that I'd hope, like me, well, I wouldn't necessarily cast myself an expert, but I'd hope, like me, anyone who's working in this space and people listening would appreciate the work you produce, because it really helps, I think, get an understanding across the people who, you know, as I mentioned, we often find you'll have analysts who have to rotate every couple of years around different desks that they monitor and they have to work on, and they may know nothing previous to that about that particular topic, that country, etc. And so, yeah, these are always ones that I sort of recommend to people and say, well, this will give you a very quick way of getting up to speed on all the key points, and then you can sort of delve into the depth from there, really.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
No, thanks for your time. It's been great, and yeah, thanks for joining us, and I'm sure the audience will have appreciated it.
Cheers.